Before that night, I had never even considered what it would be like to climb a building. It was around 11 p.m., I was in my something year of high school, and I was stuck in the basement of a friend's house who said he was going to go climb in the elementary school a few blocks away. The school was pretty short, only 1 story tall, and the gutter we climbed to reach the roof was barely a foot above our heads. I remember the unequaled thrill of being able to be on top of this monument that was never intended to have mere civilians above it. From the roof of the gymnasium, we could see the rooftops of the neighborhood, the long, narrow park that winded between the shadows of tall houses and street lamps. We could see the massive air vents and heating units from the school, pieces of its architecture that were put there specifically to prevent anyone from seeing the machinations that allow things like internal heating to be taken for granted. That night fascinated me. Because when you climb something like a school, a structure that was created with very intentional human purpose, it allows you to see the world around that structure in a way that no one intends you to have. I learned a lot more about climbing from that night on. Sometimes alone, sometimes with friends, we would cruise around our town late at night, exploring abandoned warehouses or hopping between empty buildings with low rooftops. I remember one night we found a school that had an enormous concrete ring on the top with no definite purpose, which we proceeded to use as a wrestling ring. We also saw the vast field behind it. Brief spots lit up by the supposedly eternal streetlights, a lonely tractor, and the thick darkness gnawing at its tires. I'm not going to pretend like we had any purpose for our climbs. We were a bunch of dumb kids breaking loitering laws because it made us feel powerful. But if I did say they had a purpose, I would say that seeing the world around you from a prohibited perspective can show you things that are made not to be seen, things that have been abandoned or discarded. I remember one night, walking along some overgrown train tracks and discovering an enormous, rotting wooden barn. It clearly looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. The windows were smashed apart, the metal garage door on it was rusted shut. After heaving the door open, inside, there were 2 soiled mattresses on the floor and pill bottles full of seeds and stems. It was uncanny how much this disheveled, lonely place resembled my friend's suburban basement on prom night. One of the most memorable climbs I had, though, was on top of the neighborhood Kroger. It was incredibly tall, at least much taller than anything else I had ever climbed. It was during the winter, and the gutter and ladder I needed to climb from the back were freezing to the touch. I finally reached the top, though, and when I did, it was gorgeous. The rooftop was covered in gravel and snow, the heaters were winding deep into the night, and on the other end of the building, just over the edge, was... Actually, before I show you what I mean, I want to talk a little bit about parking lots. Also, as a disclaimer, most of this section is basically stolen from this one Jacob Geller video. I have a purpose for this, I promise. Just no one tell him, he doesn't need to know. Parking lots are one of the most enormous and forgettable pieces of public infrastructure. Many cities throughout the US, large and small, have somewhere between 5 and 27 parking spaces per household. These cities make a huge deal about their parking. Compared to any other form of transportation, the automobile utterly dominates. While many buildings can be accessible to buses, trains, bikes, and pedestrians, everything must be accessible by car. Yet they also completely lack any conscious permanence. They take up enormous amounts of landmass. LA parking eats up over 17 million square meters of land. Chicago's parking and car lanes take up over 47 million, compared to the train system's mere 6 million. In Seattle, parking alone takes up 40% of the city's land. Yet for all of this land, they're completely transitory spaces. Cars in the US spend 95% of their time parked in these massive swaths of real estate. Real estate that, under a more efficient system, could be devoted to something more practical, such as providing housing to the hundreds of thousands of homeless people in the US, or creating infrastructure for a healthy economy and environment, such as public parks and domestic recycling plants. But the US is the land of the car. The land of infrastructure that is designed to be purely unobserved, occupying no space in the mind as we move our metal bodies from the grocery store to the paid parking hospital. Basically, my point is that when I walked on the roof of the grocery store I had been going to for 5 years, I saw this. There's something sublime about seeing this land from so high up and so close. Every day, hundreds of people come and go in this parking lot. They go to the Kroger, grab some food, and get out. It's a massive public place for gathering, and it occupies no space in our minds. And here it is, as empty and pure as it can ever be. Seeing this place from high up can show just how much space is devoted to something so trivial. It's literally bigger than the store itself, a fact that doesn't seem all that bizarre until you actually look at it. From this high up, it can really make you ask yourself, does it really have to be like this? What else could all this be used for? How did we get here? Part 1. Loitered Liberty. Of course, this interest in climbing isn't an entirely unique thing. It's not even inherently political. As humans, our brains are wired to associate greater height with greater power than the things below them. Climbing on top of something incredibly powerful, whether that be Mount Everest or a Walmart supercenter, can give someone an incredible sense of power. It reminds me of how me and many of my high school friends were really into the Assassin's Creed series when we were younger. Like most AAA games, the Assassin's Creed games kind of try to be 50 games in one bundles, with a stabby people game, and a crafting game, and a narrative-driven game, and a side-questing game, a boat-driving game, and a completely different narrative-driven game, and a town builder? And all of them kind of suck, but one core thesis of these games that I always really liked was this idea of exploring historic locations in ways that otherwise couldn't be seen. To this day, I remember the visceral feeling of being able to sprint through trees and across old American settlements, or climbing all the way to the top of the Hagia Sophia and looking around to see all of Constantinople in a simulated state of living and breathing. These were experiences that very few people who actually lived in these times actually had, and that absolutely no one can have now. It can make you feel like you're seeing history from a restricted perspective, or at least as restricted as a multinational corporation would allow you to see. I'm sure Ubisoft isn't planning to remake The Wretched of the Earth anytime soon. But that's kind of the problem, isn't it? The greatest limitation of a game like Assassin's Creed is that while it mimics the freedom of defying the intended design of architecture, the game is intentionally designed to allow you to do that. Every building in the game is covered in windows, ledges, clotheslines, wooden planks, and other carefully placed objects that are designed explicitly for you to get your grubby little hands and feet all over them. Because of this, if there's an accessible area in the game, it's accessible because the architects of the game wanted you to see what's there. Nothing is forbidden, and therefore there's nothing to learn about the worlds these games simulate that's really all that revolutionary. We're looking for ways to see societies from a perspective that's designed to go unseen. And if we want to do that, we have to get a bit more illegal. I want to show you what I think is one of the most fascinating channels on YouTube. This is shiey? He's Lithuanian, I don't know. His channel is entirely comprised of videos of him exploring some of the most out-of-reach urban landscapes of Eastern Europe, often by train surfing and hiking across restricted land. In his videos, he's explored abandoned factories, storage facilities full of rusting tanks and buses, an old Russian space station, and entire cities that are empty and decayed, just to name a few. Many of these locations are guarded by security, despite the fact that they seem to have lost all form and function. Technically, everything he does in these videos is illegal, but you have to ask exactly what laws is he breaking? They all really come down to anti-loitering and trespassing laws designed specifically for protecting the idea of exclusive property, even property that no longer serves a purpose to society. Nothing he does in his videos harms anyone in any way, except potentially himself, because oh my god, he's carrying around a camera on a selfie stick while walking around the edge of a ventilation tower. Seriously, what the fuck? So the laws he's breaking are rather trivial, but by challenging the sanctity of property, he's able to show things that the societies he travels to would rather keep hidden. He shows the things that a society has given up on and abandoned, and the architecture that once represented that. You know, in the United States, a very young country, we're often given this idea that cities can't die, that they're man-made titans, they're just too big to fail. But if you look in the right places, you can see that even the inanimate things that people create have mortality. The legal and physical infrastructure that keeps these places unseen are often made to prevent people from seeing the failures of a society in their daily lives, and can make it hard to realize that our societies are not gods. There's a reason why many of Shiey's videos, and often the most popular ones, share the same tagline: illegal freedom. But it's kind of hard to talk about this channel without talking about Chernobyl. There's supposed to be a joke here, but I forgot where I put it. Some of his most popular videos feature him exploring the Chernobyl exclusion zone. He even took some trips during the winter because, again, he's an absolute madman. Besides showing the long hikes toward the zone, where he has to constantly check his Geiger counter and stay out of sight of police, he spends most of his time exploring the city, and seeing just what the Chernobyl disaster did to it. Most of the buildings there are still standing, cluttered by the belongings of those who once lived there. Mattresses, records, classrooms. In an old school building, they find a basketball court, and in another, an indoor pool. Unless you live in Ukraine or you completely understand what caused the Chernobyl explosion, which honestly, who does, this disaster can seem more like fiction than reality, probably because it's often treated as such. The stories of what happened here have spread across the globe, but until you've seen what this place actually looks like, until you've seen the recollections of humanity that still linger in the city, they'll only ever be stories. In one of these videos, he climbs the city's still standing Ferris wheel, and from this high up, way off in the distance, you can see the sarcophagus. That little pale dome, that spot, barely distinguishable on the horizon, is what caused all of this. This is the structure that, even after being surrounded by 25 meters of pure steel and concrete, is still too unsafe to approach without heavy protective equipment. As we know now, this wasn't entirely an accident. Nuclear scientists approached the government numerous times, warning of the disaster, who were promptly silenced out of the USSR leadership's rabid desire for nuclear competition. Chernobyl was a mass extermination, created due to the Soviet Union prioritizing their image of nuclear development over the lives of their people. The world knows this now, sure, but with this place kept under such massively tight security, very few people can truly feel what this means. The less people see it, the better. Guess that's not working out too well now, huh? But there's a bit of an issue with the narrative I'm telling here. Up until now, I've assumed that atrocities committed by a society are all hidden behind the legal and physical infrastructure of that society. And while this is true in some cases, it ignores the reality that there are many disasters whose consequences are seen very clearly. It ignores the disasters that bear over our horizons daily, that have done so for so long that they become part of our lives. Part 2. Memories of Paris. When I was in my second year of undergrad, I decided to take a trip to Paris, Texas. It was a particularly awful year for me, and I just needed to go somewhere. I went to Paris, Texas because I really loved the movie that's named after the town, which is largely about how American culture creates imitations of happiness and contentment at the expense of allowing its people to have any kind of concrete identity. It's also because I'm a pretentious dipshit. I had no idea what I would find there. I spent a couple days hopping between Amtraks, a Greyhound, and a shuttle whose driver had been waiting for me at a gas station for at least 2 hours. When I got there, I found a town that felt incredibly familiar. It wasn't very different from the small towns I knew in the Midwest. Walk a couple blocks in any direction, and it's unlikely you won't stumble upon abandoned factories, landfills, and vacant buildings that at one point served as the businesses and industries that once made this town much more alive. I'd always kind of assumed that towns like this were mostly in the Midwest. I mean, it's called the Rust Belt for a reason. Yet the massive rusting hulks and empty shopping districts of a long-gone industrial era were here too. It's not difficult to explain if you know what's happened to towns like this. The rise of globalization caused industries that once made small-town America thrive, like manufacturing and energy, to be shipped to countries with cheaper labor. Small businesses became unable to compete as massive international behemoths consolidated and spread all over the country. Less local businesses, more Walmarts and McDonald's, and bigger parking lots. The consequences of this can be seen everywhere in this town. This is no Chernobyl, no sudden cataclysm happened here. But the massive globalization of the US economy has slowly and quietly devastated towns like this all across the country. Now, I don't want to pretend like I know this town. I've never lived here, I'm just some kid who dropped in for a week to get away from his life at school. But I can't help but ask, how many people remember what this town used to be like? This is small town America. Most people don't want to hear about what some global market is doing to their lifestyles. They have enough at home to worry about. How many people are really aware of the institutional, global forces that have made their lives this way? When you live somewhere like this, you can see the decay this town has faced, but this itself isn't enough to understand why that is. Without this understanding, you could easily forget the past and assume that something better is impossible. Of course, Paris, Texas is not unique in this respect, partially because there are so many Parises here that it's actually hilarious. Depending on what you count as a town, there are anywhere between 9 and 21 Parises in the United States. Like, you couldn't come up with a different city to rip off of? I guess all the other states already took London, Delhi, Berlin, and Africa? But it's also because places like this are all over the US. Not hidden, but if you're privileged enough, kept out of sight just enough that you don't have to acknowledge them. They're the abandoned manufacturing plants in Ohio and coal mines in Kentucky that hooked workers on painkillers starting the opioid epidemic. They're neighborhoods like East Cleveland that were driven into poverty by real estate owners and employers who institutionally denied homes and jobs to Black Americans. Paris, Texas is not unique. To see that, you just need to know where to look. But Paris, Texas is unique in one very bizarre respect, which is probably the only reason anyone outside Texas has ever even heard of it. A replica of the Eiffel Tower, the second tallest one in the United States. It's printed all over the town's local magazines and brochures. If this town has any kind of cultural export anymore, this is it. What's actually really funny is that the same year that Paris, Texas decided to build their Eiffel Tower, the town of Paris, Tennessee decided to do exactly the same thing, only their Eiffel Tower was a few feet taller. The people of Paris, Texas took the only logical step and added a 5-foot-tall cowboy hat on top of their tower. Honestly, I aspire to one day become this petty. But there's one thing about this tower that you'll never see in any of their promotional material. Right next to the tower, over to the right, is a war memorial. Not just for any one war, but all the wars our country has fought over the past century, starting from World War I. Enormous black slabs are erected into the sky, engraved with the names of the people of Paris who lost their lives. The slabs are so big that the names of those honored barely take up any space. Some of the slabs don't even have names at all, they're completely empty. They're waiting to have the dead etched into them. These monuments, intended to honor, are horrifying. These slabs were not created for the dead, they were created in expectation of the dead. This town is tiny, it has a population of about 25,000, yet this monument was created by people who firmly believe that so many of them could die in combat, that they keep slabs that could record literally hundreds of names for them just in case. What does it say about a society that would build something like this? Our country has been in wars in the Middle East ever since the turn of the century, with our leaders giving no indication of stopping. Even assuming that these wars go on indefinitely, it would take decades to fill out these monuments with the names of people from this town. What does it say about our society if we fully expect and accept that so many of us will eventually die at the will of politicians who get paid to sit in chairs and trade money with oil companies and weapon manufacturers behind closed doors? Why does citizenship mean being ready and willing to give your life and murder civilians to fatten a rich person's bank account? Why does this feel so familiar? Familiar. Like I said earlier, Paris, Texas is not unique. The cracks seen in this town can be seen just about anywhere else in America. The question is whether we get to see these cracks for what they really are. Our country has seen millions of jobs leave and wages stagnate due to globalization, but that's not the story most people will hear. Most people will hear a corporate news network tell them that illegal immigrants are taking all the jobs, or that young people just don't work hard enough to make a living wage. Meanwhile, millions of people, especially people of color, are thrown into prisons, kept out of sight, and forced into unpaid labor for minor drug offenses, all under the pretense of serving justice. And if you drive a car, you can spend your whole life passing between parking lots, never once considering what the world around you is built for. All the problems I've talked about here go beyond architecture. Simply changing the physical structure of our society isn't enough to address the laws and culture that allow the greatest disasters of a society to occur. Yet, approaching that architecture in a way that it's not designed for can help reveal those disasters and the reasons they exist. It's easy to assume that the status quo is unchanging, but being physically above the institutions we're told are permanent can be a powerful, visceral step in realizing the possibility of a better world. So, am I saying that you should go climb on top of private buildings, train surf, and wander around towns hundreds of miles away? Yes.